Welcome back to Reality Asserts Itself on the Real News Network. Eddie Conway, former member of the Baltimore chapter of the Black Panther Party, writes in his book, Martial Law, The Life and Times of a Baltimore Black Panther, writing about the death of his brother-in-law in Vietnam about a year after Eddie joined the Army. The loss of someone so young and vibrant always strikes at the heart. As youth, we're so unprepared for death because we thought we would live forever. None of us could see the deathly shadow that hung so heavily over our generation. Yet it was there, Vietnam. Angry and unable to articulate my feelings of loss and grief, I made plans to go. I needed to lash out at someone. This is the dilemma of the man of African descent in this country. Oppression quite naturally creates anger, and all too often that emotion is folded up in the confusion of being American. And then it's directed not at the oppressor, but at the first available target, who quite often looks like us. Now joining us in the studio again is Eddie Conway. Thanks for joining us again.
Okay.
One more time, Eddie got out of jail after 44 years of being incarcerated for a crime which he has always declared his innocence, and I think just about anyone who's ever looked at the case has come to the conclusion that he was innocent. And there's lots of material available. You can go and take a look at the facts on Wikipedia and other places. After 44 years, Eddie is out and he's back being an activist in Baltimore again. So let's go back to that moment. You're in the Army. At the end of the last segment, you talked about starting to really, in some ways for the first time, how systemic and structural the racism was in the Army, and beginning to resist. You beat up some Klans guys and such. But then this hits, and you want to go to Vietnam. You want to go fight.
Yeah, well, yes, I think it was guilt as much as anything else. My brother-in-law had joined the military because I encouraged him to. In fact, it was like 4 of us joined together, and 2 of us ended up in Europe, and 2 of us ended up in Vietnam. My brother-in-law was one of the people that ended up in Vietnam. Pretty much he was following me, and he went over there, and he wasn't over there a hot second before he got ambushed and killed. And I always felt responsible for that. I felt like he wouldn't have been there if he hadn't have been following me. And then I felt like I had a responsibility to revenge his death. And toward that end, and it's at the same time, in spite of the racism in the Army, still believing that the communist menace in Vietnam and the threat to Asia was part of America's noble obligation to make the world safe for democracy.
We're what, about 1965 now?
We're in 66.
66.
So
there's a big anti-war movement.
Yes.
There's a lot of people speaking out about the injustice of the war and that it's terrible foreign policy and so on. But you don't blame U.S. foreign policy, you blame Vietnamese.
I blame Vietnamese because it was personal, for one thing. 2, there was a tremendous amount of anti-war people in Europe, dodging the draft, etc. But most of them were white. And most of the black people that I came in contact with in Europe was either Africans or either soldiers, and soldiers in the sense of sergeants or corporals or dedicated, committed to the military philosophy. So I still hadn't separated out America's racism from its racism around the world and its colonialization of people of color all around the world. And I still kind of, at that point, still felt like, by that time I was a sergeant, in fact. So I had become part of the military apparatus itself, and that platoon that I had joined a couple of years before, I was actually in charge of it then. And it had became mostly black also. And so I had a vested interest.
But you see a photograph that starts to really shake you.
Yes, one morning, because I was in charge, I didn't have to go out to formations. I would send my guys out. They would go do whatever they needed to do. Because I didn't bother them, they would actually do it. And they would bring me breakfast. And so I'm like in there, and I'm sitting on the bed, and I'm eating breakfast, and I'm reading the newspaper, and I open the newspaper up, and this is, you know, this is something that it still haunts me. I looked at the front of the newspaper, it was the Stars and Stripes, and there in the middle of Newark, New Jersey, is a tank. And that tank has a machine gun on it. And that machine gun is pointed at 25, 30 black women on the corner, and they're protesting. And I'm sitting there, and I'm looking at that, and there's this little white guy. He's sitting there with his fingers like a half an inch from the trigger of that machine gun. And what's important about this is that the bullets were like that, were like huge bullets, 50 caliber bullets. The gun is driven by electricity. If you press those buttons, it'll fire 25 or 30 times without anything. You can't get away from it. It's like it electrocutes you for a minute. You hit it, and it bounces so much you can't let it go, even when you're trying to let it go. And it'll fire off 25, 30 rounds. All of those women would have been dead on the corner. And I looked at that, and I said, dag, my mother could be in that crowd of black women there. So I read the story, and apparently the National Guard Armory had been robbed of some weapons by some black guys, and they went through the black community and locked up every black guy in the community, put them all in a stadium or somewhere, and then they went back and they tore up all the houses in the black community, ripped up the floorboards, whipped in the basements, tore out the walls and whatnot, looking for those guns. And the women were out on the street corner protesting because of the way they violated the houses. Not just that the guys were locked up, but they ripped houses up. And then they had the audacity to put a tank in the middle of the community and point guns at unarmed women like this. And so I'm sitting there on my bed, and I'm looking up at my locker, and there is my uniform, and I've already signed up to go to Vietnam, and I'm thinking like, well, wait, what's going on here? Something is seriously wrong. Finally, it dawned on me that, okay, you're in this army and you're promoting this stuff, and they're using that same army in the black community to do what you get ready to go into Vietnam to do. Something's wrong with this picture. I need to get out of the army and go home and see if I can help fix things. And I never put that uniform back on again. From that day, I actually had my re-enlistment papers tore up, applied for a leave, went on leave, stayed on leave, came back, renewed the leave, and kept doing that until my time was up. And then I had to put that uniform on one last time. I put that uniform on because they wouldn't let you sign out from the army without being in the uniform. And it was just no way I could avoid that. So I put that uniform on to sign out, right? And then I don't even know if it was the Hudson River. I don't know where I threw it. I threw it in the river up in New York.
The uniform.
The uniform, right? All of it, right? But I still wasn't jaded. I still thought that, okay, there's problems. Obviously, there's been riots, there's conflict, there's fighting, there's all kinds of stuff going on. This can be fixed. Good people just need to come together, figure out what the problem is, integrate the lunch counter, you know, talk to the police and have them put the dogs away, whatever, we could make a difference, you know. And I'm 21 now, so I'm still idealistic, and I'm still hopeful that, okay, there's problems, but we can fix them. You know, we just need to figure out how to fix them. So and that's why I started working with CORE in NAACP.
And what do you do?
Well,
in Baltimore?
In Baltimore, the first thing I did when I got home, I went to Johns Hopkins and I took a job at Johns Hopkins. At that time, I was actually I was a PA by then because I had been trained and all that kind of stuff, right? But I ended up as an operating room technician at Johns Hopkins. I went to work for Johns Hopkins, and then I started checking to find out what was going on. And what was actually happening in the city was that we were trying to get white collar jobs. You know, there's a tremendous black workforce, but probably 99% of them were in blue collar jobs. And we wanted some of those white collar jobs because what we discovered was even after the Civil Rights Bill passed and all of the places were integrated and we were allowed to send our children to college and all of those things, we couldn't afford it on the blue collar salaries. We couldn't afford to go down into the restaurant and eat.
While you're at Hopkins, there's a surgery that takes place.
Oh, God.
That infuriates you.
Yes, and it really infuriated me because, you know, by being a medic, by being someone that understood, you know, I worked in hospitals while I was in the military. I understood operating rooms under the procedure, whatnot. There was this particular case where this doctor actually performed a mastectomy. That's the removal of both breasts from a woman. At that time, this is 68 now, at that time, it was a 3-hour operation. I don't know what kind of time it takes now to do it. But it was dictated by the scalpel, the technology, everything else. It in general takes 3 hours. He had a golf game to go to in an hour's time, and he literally butchered that woman on the table while I was in the operating room. Black woman in her 50s, and he sawed off her breasts, pretty much. And because he was the head surgeon, he had surgeons, he had minor surgeons, there were head nurses, there was anesthesiologists, etc. There was a resident there, you know, people being trained. So it was like 10 people in the operating room. And what I didn't understand at the time, because I'm still kind of like not really picking up on this, is I was the only black person in the operating room. I didn't realize it at the time. I mean, we were in there doing the job. You know, everybody had the job.
You and the woman on the table.
Yeah, me. Oh, that's right. That's right. I didn't even consider that. It was 11 people in the operating room, the woman that got killed.
Yeah, we should say it. She died not long after this.
Yeah. Well, she got killed. He cut her breasts off, and she bled to death. And the whole time there was this mild discussion going on between the junior surgeons and the chief surgeon and the resident. And basically the discussion was going on like, oh, we're losing a lot of fluid. It's not cauterizing that, because at the time you used the electrical scalpel and you cut, and it burned both sides, and it not just cut an area, but it also healed or burned or sealed that area if you do it slow enough, right? And but he was doing it so fast it wasn't cauterizing, and
this
then
is
the blood.
Because he wants to go to a golf game.
He wanted to go to the golf game, right? And even hearing that and seeing that and all of that stuff, it was like I was infuriated about it, but it still didn't trigger any kind of response from me. It was only after the operation, and you know, I knew she had died, and he was out in the hallway talking to her daughter and her husband. When I came by, I had to go, because I was the operating room technician. I was the person that brought the people in and prepared them and set them up. And so I had to go get the next person. And I don't even know if it was for that room. It was for probably another room, because that room wasn't clean. And as I was on my way to get the next person, I had to go past through the waiting room, And he's standing out there and he's telling this woman and her husband that he did all he could to save her life. And I went temporarily insane. I have to admit to that.
In the book, you mentioned that behind his back, he's holding his golf.
Yeah,
his,
you know,
gloves,
and so I'm passing behind him when he's saying it, and I'm seeing him. He's got his golf shoes on, and he's got his golf gloves in his hand. And I'm like, "You're lying, motherfucker," you know. And I just went off, and I ended up hitting him, and I knocked him down, and of course, you know, they called security on me, you know, crazy black man loose in the hospital. I had to end up going to the administration, but I'm like, look, I was in there. He killed her. Y'all need to charge him. It's murder. I'm not letting this go. Y'all fixing this. And called the Afro. I called, you know, I just, you know, and because I knew he should have been in jail. And everybody's like, no, 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 no. Finally,
What the Afro did?
Well, they said that the only way we would...
Afro still is, but at that time particularly, it was a big newspaper.
Yeah,
for the
it was probably the
community.
third paper in the city at the time, right? Basically, they said to me, it's like, look, you know, you just a technician. You don't know what doctors know. You can't understand what was motivating, driving this whole operation. You need a doctor to look at the records and to verify what you're saying. Yeah. So I didn't have a problem with that because I'm like, okay, any doctor that look at the record will know that this was murder. You know, all the people in the room knew that, you know. But initially what I did was I went to try to talk to the people in the room, and it was then that it dawned on me that they were all white except for one nurse, which was a Korean nurse. And I said, what's up with this? I didn't even realize I was black, I guess. I mean, in all fairness, I didn't realize there was a problem there. And I talked to the Korean nurse, and she's like, no, I can't get involved. I don't, you know.
Nobody would say anything.
It's the law of silence. You don't say anything about the surgeons. You don't say anything about the big doctors. They're the money makers.
I mean, was the Afro saying you're only a technician, or the Afro was saying you're black, you better find somebody white who can say something?
No, they were saying I was only a technician and I needed a doctor to verify, you know, to look at the records and to verify. Well, I didn't really at that time. I knew it was murder, and I knew how much time it take for one of those kind of operations, right? So I went throughout the hospital looking for a black doctor because I from the operating room, it was clear to me none of the white doctors were gonna say anything at all. So I go to and perhaps this is wrong, but this was my personal experience. 2 black doctors at Johns Hopkins at that time. One was down in pathology, you know, and right away he told me, don't get involved. It happens all the time. These bodies come through here. Forget it, just go on about your business. At the time I had like a GI Bill, you know, because I'd been in the Army, I got out, so I was eligible to go to medical school. I was at the time like a PA, so I was gonna go to Johns Hopkins to their medical school. That was my plan, getting into Johns Hopkins, getting into their school. The tuition was half price because I was an employee. The Army was gonna pay for it, etc., you know. So I'm looking at a career.
But you don't find a black doctor who will speak out.
So I leave this guy because he tells me, don't get involved, don't do it, you know, don't mess yourself up. You know, this is your career, go, you know, do whatever you need to do to, you know. And I'm like, no, this is not right. I'm not gonna go for this. So I go and of course I'm asking questions, and finally they say, well, there's a black doctor up in hematology, I think it was, the blood lab. And so I go up to the lab and I open the door, and here's this black guy in the white smock with coffee and tea and sugar and whatnot.
He's the doctor.
He's the doctor, and the people sitting around the lab, some of them are just technicians.
And he's serving them.
He's serving them. And I knew it was, I knew that was a ball game for me, right? So I tried to talk to him, and he wasn't trying to hear it at all, and I can't get involved, so and so and so. I'm doing my residency, blah, 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 you know. So I just went on, and I said, well, okay, and I couldn't raise enough hell. So they offered me, what they said was like, you know, you can go to the University of Maryland. We'll send you down to the University of Maryland.
They didn't want to fire you for hitting a doctor in the face.
Yeah, they didn't want it to be an incident.
Because they knew where
Yeah, because they knew I was trying to make it into, and I wasn't trying to make it in an incident. I was incensed that he had killed this woman, you know. I wasn't looking for an incident, but, you know, it was there. It happened, right?
The family knew how incensed you were?
I told the father, well, her husband, I told the daughter. They never did anything. They, you know, I guess they was compensated in some kind of way by Johns Hopkins, and I wouldn't take the job down the University of Maryland. I just went on and I said, you know, I can't be in this profession because of what just happened is not anything that I could allow to happen around me. And so I actually left, you know. But I left, basically, I went and I said, well, okay, I need to go work somewhere else. And so I was working with Core and them anyway, so I said, well, okay, I'll go and help integrate the Spurs Point Fire Department. And I left and went there.
And you become a fireman.
I became a fireman.
And you become an organizer.
At that time, I became an organizer also.
Okay, well, in the next segment of our interview, we're going to talk more with Eddie Conway. He's now becoming not just enraged at what happened at Hopkins, but he's going to put that rage into becoming a much more conscious organizer. So please join us for a continuation of this series on Reality Asserts Itself.